I bought plane tickets for the whole family, but at the airport, my daughter-in-law smiled and said, "We gave your ticket to my mom. The grandkids love her more." My son agreed. I stood there for a second, then quietly nodded and walked away. They thought that was the end of it. A minute later, I made one call, and suddenly they were begging me to cancel the trip. But to understand what happened at that airport, you have to understand what I spent the last 30 years building and what I spent the last 10 years quietly handing over to people who had already decided I was done. My name is Diane Ellison. I am 62 years old. I spent 28 years as a corporate finance director for a mid-sized logistics company in Atlanta, the kind of company nobody outside the industry has heard of, but the kind that processes enough freight volume to matter. I started as a staff accountant at 26, 2 years after my son Marcus was born, and worked my way up through budget analysis, treasury, risk management, controller, and eventually the CFO's office, though my title always stopped one rung short because the man in that chair didn't believe women were built for the top seat. I knew it. He knew it. We never said it out loud, and I kept doing his job while he attended Genesis. I'm telling you this because it matters. The version of me that walked into that airport terminal had spent nearly 3 decades making hard calls, under pressure, restructuring budgets. Others had let bleed, shutting down divisions that cost more than they'd ever returned. I was not a woman who collapsed under discomfort. I was not a woman who let sentiment override arithmetic. And yet for 10 years I let it happen anyway, because arithmetic and family are 2 different things. Or at least that's what I told myself. Marcus was my only child. His father left when Marcus was 4. Not dramatically. No. Screaming. No single catastrophic event. Gerald just slowly became someone who preferred being elsewhere. And one morning he was gone for good. I got the house, a modest settlement, and the full weight of raising a small boy alone in a city where my closest family was a cousin I saw at funerals. I don't say that to ask for pity. I say it because it's the context for every decision I made afterward. When you are the only thing standing between your child and chaos, you don't have to. You work the extra hours. You skip the vacations. You sit with the flashcards at 9 o'clock at night when you're exhausted because that boy is going to read at grade level if it kills you. And Marcus was a good kid. I want to be clear about that because what I'm about to tell you is complicated, and it's easy to paint someone entirely in one color when you're angry at them. Marcus was sweet-natured and curious, and he had a laugh that could change the temperature of a room. He was also from a very young age conflict averse in a way I probably should have paid more attention to. He didn't fight, didn't push back, didn't assert himself when situations called for it. I thought it was gentleness. I thought I was raising a man who wouldn't turn into his father. What I didn't understand until it was almost too late was that there's a difference between gentleness and absence of spine. One is a virtue, the other is a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. Ranatata filled Marcus' vacuum. When he was 27, they met at a house party in Dekar. She was 24, beautiful in an aggressive way, the kind of beautiful that announces itself and expects acknowledgement. She had a sharp intelligence and a sharper tongue and an ability to assess a room in 30 seconds that I actually admired the first time I saw it. She reminded me a little of myself, which is part of why I gave her the benefit of the doubt for so long. I recognized the machinery. What I didn't recognize fast enough was how that machinery was being pointed They dated. For 2 years, I was polite and open and genuinely tried to like her. There were things to like. She was funny when she wanted to be a good hostess. Kept an immaculate house. When Marcus proposed, I cried. The good kind of crying, because I wanted him to be happy, and he looked happy. The wedding was beautiful. I paid for most of it, which Renata accepted without comment, as though this were simply the expected arrangement, not out of malice. I think it was more that she'd grown up in a family where parents paid for things and adult children received them, and she saw nothing unusual about mapping that expectation onto me. I told myself it was generational. I told myself it would normalize once they were established. I was partially right about the generational piece. I was completely wrong about the normalizing. Their first apartment was in Midtown. Marcus was working in sales for a tech startup, making decent money. Renata had a job in marketing. They were fine. And then the twins came, Aiden and Lily, born 14 months after the wedding, and the calculus changed overnight. Renata quit her job. I didn't object. Raising 2 newborns is genuinely hard, but quitting without discussing it first, without running the numbers, without acknowledging that the math now didn't work, that was the first real signal I should have taken more seriously. They needed help. I gave it. That's the simple version. The longer version is that I began a pattern of financial support that started small and grew the way all financial support grows when there's no end date attached and no honest conversation about what it means. A few hundred here for diapers and formula, a larger chunk when the apartment lease jumped. A loan, we called it a loan when Marcus launched his own consulting practice. Another loan. We stopped calling it a loan when the consulting practice needed operating capital in year 2. Marcus Consulting practice had real clients at the beginning, 2 small companies from his startup days that hired him for strategy work. He was good at it. In a vacuum, with the right support, the business might have grown into something real, but the business didn't exist in a vacuum. It existed in a household where the overhead kept expanding, where Renata standards had a velocity the revenue couldn't match, and where Marcus, conflict averse, people leasing, Marcus was constitutionally unable to say, we need to spend less. So I became the backstock. I structured it carefully because I'm a finance person. A defined monthly transfer for household support, a separate line item for the children's school. They'd enrolled Aiden and Lily in a private school that cost 3 times the public option. A discretionary account for business expenses with the understanding it would be repaid when the business hit certain milestones. The milestones never came. The repayment never came. The defined monthly amount kept expanding every time. I looked up and I kept adjusting the guardrails instead of holding them, because every time I raised the subject, Marcus would look at me with that expression. Not guilt exactly, more like grief, like the conversation itself was a wound, and I would find a reason to let it go another month. There were also the assets, the car, a black Expedition 2. Years old. I bought it because Marcus' old car was unreliable and he had client meetings. I put it in my name for insurance and tax reasons, and also, if I'm honest with myself, because having it in my name gave me a feeling of control that the money transfers didn't. As long as the car was mine, there was at least one thing I could take back. The office came 2 years later. Marcus had landed a larger client and needed proper space. I found it, negotiated the lease, paid the deposit and first year up front because the landlord wanted a corporate Guarantee I could provide, and Marcus couldn't. I put in my name. He called it his office. He showed it to people as his office. His business cards listed it as his office. It was my office. It had always been my office. I'm not telling you this to sound calculating. I'm telling you because when I finally looked honestly at what I'd built and who I'd built it for, I had to sit with the fact that I had participated in this fiction willingly. I told myself I was supporting my son. I told myself I was investing in my grandchildren's stability. Both of those things were partially true, but underneath both of them, I was terrified of being unnecessary, terrified that if the money stopped, the relationship would, too. That's the part that took me a long time to say out loud. Now, let me tell you about Renata's mother. Pet came into our orbit gradually, the way certain weather systems do. You don't notice the pressure dropping until you're already in the middle of it. She was 63, recently widowed, and she had the energy of a woman who had spent her whole life being the most important person in every room and was not prepared to retire. That title, she had opinions about the twin school, the apartment, the neighborhood, opinions about Marcus that she delivered to Renata loudly enough that Marcus could always hear them from the next room. He was too passive, not building fast enough, didn't have the drive a man his age should have. She offered these assessments with the breezy confidence of someone who believed speaking truth is always a gift, regardless of whether it was requested. What she never questioned was money. She never asked where it came from. As far as Pet was concerned, Marcus was a successful consultant. Their house was a testament to that success, and the grandmother who paid for most of it was performing the appropriate function. She received me with the warm reserved for useful appliances. I should have seen the airport thing coming. I can trace the line directly. 5 years of Pet at every family gathering. The gradual shift in how the twins talked about their two grandmothers. I became the grandmother who gave them things. Pet became the grandmother who played with them. I became the grandmother who worried. Pet became the grandmother who was fun. I had a job and a house and a retirement to manage. Pet had a calendar full of afternoons. I don't blame Pet for being available. I don't even blame the kids for gravitating toward her. Children follow warmth and play, not provision. But I noticed the shift, and I felt it the way you feel a draft before you find the open window. The trip to the resort started as my idea. I'd been planning it for 8 months. The resort was a private club property on a Caribbean island, the kind of place with a waiting list for membership, the kind I'd filed away as something for someday. I had become a member 3 years prior. The membership had specific terms, one of which was a presence requirement at check-in. I'd noted it when I signed. I'd noted it again when I booked. The trip was for 5 people. Me, Marcus, Renata, Aiden, and Lily. 5 days. My birthday fell on day 3. I hadn't told Marcus that. I didn't want the weight of that expectation hanging over the whole thing. I just wanted the ocean. I wanted to watch my grandchildren see a coral reef for the first time. I wanted to sit on a deck over water with a glass of something cold and feel for 5 consecutive days like I had earned the life I'd spent 30 years building. I paid for everything. Business class flights, all 5 seats, round trip, the private boat transfer, the villa, 3 bedrooms, a pool, extending over the water, a deck where you could watch the pelicans dive at sunrise. Everything in one transaction. 8 months out. Total outlay $47,000, not counting incidentals. I didn't announce it dramatically. 2 months before the trip, I sat down with Marcus at my kitchen table and showed him the resort website. I watched his face open up the way a face does when someone gives you something genuinely unexpected and beautiful. And I felt a warmth I had been chasing for years in that relationship. He called Renata from my kitchen. I heard her voice through the phone, that register of excitement she reserved for things that impressed her. She asked 3 questions. What island? What's the resort called? Are the rooms nice? Not thank you. Not that so generous. Just the rapid appraisal of someone cataloging an asset. I should have felt something then. I did. A small contraction somewhere in my chest. Quick. And gone. I explained it away. The week before departure, I noticed Pat had gone quiet on the family group chat. She posted constantly. Articles, recipes, photos of the twins. The silence read like someone keeping a secret. I noted it. I didn't act on it. The morning of the trip, the Uber arrived at 6:30. I was packed and ready before it pulled up. I was raised by a woman who believed being on time was already 5 minutes late. Marcus met me at the curb. B looked distracted, not travel nervous. Something else. His eyes tracked away from mine. He said Renata had taken her own car because she had things to drop off somewhere. That was the first lie. When we got to the airport, Renata was near the check-in counter with the twins. Aiden ran to me and said he'd looked up what a coral reef was and wanted to catch a fish. Lily told me she'd packed her mermaid swimsuit and needed me to see it. I was still crouched down talking to them when I noticed the suitcase, a large rolling bag off to the side with a luggage tag I didn't recognize at that distance. I stood up slowly. Pet came through the terminal doors like she lived there. Wide-brimmed sun hat, printed wrap, dress, the stride of a woman who had already decided how the day would go. She greeted the twins loudly with theatrical love. She hugged Renata. She nodded at Marcus, who was studying the departures board with suspicious intensity. She did not look at me. I understood in that moment fully and completely what was happening. I didn't need it explained. I had spent 28 years in rooms where people were about to tell you something you weren't going to like. And I had learned to feel the shape of those rooms before anyone opened their mouth. Renata turned to me. That specific smile, the one that means the decision has already been made. And the smile is just the packaging. Diane, she said she always used my name when she wanted to sound reasonable. We've been thinking, and we really feel it would be better for the trip, better for the kids. Especially if Mom came along instead of you. I said instead, you know how the kids are with her. They're just so comfortable, and it's a long flight, and honestly, with your blood pressure, my blood pressure is managed, I said. And this is my birthday trip. I hadn't meant to say that last part. I'd kept it to myself for 8 months, and it came out not as an accusation, but as a correction, a fact that had been omitted. Renata blinked. We didn't know it was your birthday. I know you didn't, I said. Marcus was still looking at the departures board. I turned to him. Marcus, he turned slowly, the way people turn when they've been dreading the moment of turning. His face had the quality of a man who agreed to something and now has to watch the consequence. Arriva in real time. He looked young in that moment. Younger than 40, younger than the father of twins, younger than a man who had borrowed $300,000 from his mother over a decade and never once said the word repayment unprompted. Mom, he said, Val is right. It's just Pet is really good with the kids, and you can Mean you can come next time. There is no next time. I said, this trip is not transferable. I said it quietly, the way I said things in boardrooms when I wanted people to understand I wasn't posturing. I said it looking directly at him. Marcus looked away. That was the moment I understood he wasn't going to say anything. Whatever conversation had happened between him and Ranata in the days before this morning had already concluded without me. My presence here was the delivery of a verdict. I looked at Ranata. I looked at Pet, who was now helping Lily with her backpack and trying very hard not to look satisfied. I looked at my grandchildren, oblivious and beautiful. I looked at the tickets in my bag, the 5 of them organized, the way I organized everything, and I nodded. All right, I said, Ranata, visibly relaxed. She said something. I knew you'd understand, but I was already walking. I walked toward the exit, not fast. I had already done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was very clear. I pushed through the terminal doors into the Atlanta Morning and took out my phone. I made 3 calls. The first was to the resort. I had the reservations. Manager's direct number. We'd spoken for times over the 8 months since I booked. Her name was Claudette. She answered on the second ring. Miss Ellison, are you on your way? No, I said I need to cancel the primary reservation. I won't be attending. Please invoke the non-transfer clause in the membership agreement. A brief silence. Of course, I'm so sorry your plans changed. Thank you, Claudette. 4 minutes. The second call was to the fleet management company that held the title on Marcus Expedition. My account representative, Howard, had the pleasant manner of someone who'd been in the business long enough to stop being surprised by anything. I told him the expedition had been removed from my property without explicit authorization, and I wanted a flag placed on the vehicle pending review. He said, done. 6 minutes. The third call was to my bank. 90 seconds on hold. Instructions. Reduce the supplemental card attached to Renata's name to a 0 spending limit. Flag the primary account for administrative hold, pending my review. The representative confirmed. Read it back. Thank me for my patience. Less time than it took Renata to hand my seat away. I put my phone in my bag and walked to the long-term parking structure where I'd left my own car, not the car service I'd arranged for the family, my personal car, which I'd driven and parked before the Uber pickup. That morning, I had packed a bag for the trip, but I had also, in the way that people who have spent 30 years managing risk tend to do things, kept an exit ready. I drove home. It was 8:40 in the morning. The city had that particular quality it gets when most people are already where they're going and the roads belong to the rest of us. I drove with the windows down and the radio off. I had not cried. I want to be clear about that. I had things at the airport. A hard-dropping sensation when Marcus looked away, a flash of something bright, and painful when the twins ran to Pet, with that unself-conscious joy children have when they go to who they want. But I had not cried. I do it later in private like a solvent that takes a while to work through what has accumulated. I got home. I made tea, and I am not a tea person. I drink coffee. But that morning I made tea because there is something about the ritual that is slower, more deliberate, and I wanted to be deliberate. I sat at my kitchen table and thought about the last 10 years. I thought about the first transfer, $300 a Tuesday afternoon, because the twins needed pediatric checkups and they were between insurance plans. I remember thinking it was fine. It was temporary. It would sort itself out. I remember typing in the routing number with the practiced ease of someone who had wired money professionally for decades. I thought about how that first transfer became a rhythm, the way rhythms become expectations, the way expectations become entitlements. So quietly you don't notice the transformation until you're standing at a check-in counter, being told your seat has been given to someone else. I thought about a dinner 2 years ago at Renata's parents' house. Her father, Russell, a retired electrician, quiet man, showed dogs as a hobby, pulled me aside in the kitchen, and said, "Your son's a lucky man. Diane, you do a lot for them," he said, it with the gentleness of someone trying to communicate more than the words were carrying. I changed the subject because I wasn't ready to receive what he was actually saying. Russell died 8 months later, heart attack. No warning. I thought about him now and wished I'd been more present in that kitchen conversation. I thought about Marcus as a small boy, 7 years old, the age Aiden and Lily were now climbing into bed with me on Saturday mornings and asking for a story. I'm not a natural storyteller. I'm a numbers person, but I learned to tell stories for him. Improvise things about astronauts and talking dogs and kingdoms under the sea. And he would listen with his whole body, still in a way children usually aren't. I thought those mornings were the best I had to offer. I wondered if he remembered them. I finished my tea. I washed the cup. I went into the living room and looked at the fuss in the corner, root-bound, visibly cramped, the roots already pressing against the bottom of the pot. I bought new soil 2 weeks ago and hadn't gotten around to it. I got the soil now. I was halfway through the repotting when my phone started. Renata called first. I let it ring. Then a voicemail notification came through and I set the phone next to the ficus and kept working. 47 seconds long. That voicemail, I listened to it 3 times later. In it, her voice moved through confusion, frustration, and something trying to sound like concern. Without quite getting there, the reservation had been canceled. There was a clause. My name wasn't on the membership. Could I call the hotel and sort this out? It was not a misunderstanding. Marcus called next. 3 calls in 8 minutes. Then a number I didn't recognize. A Florida area code. The hotel, most likely. Then nothing for 20 minutes, which told me they'd boarded. The flight was 12 hours with a connection. For 12 hours, I had peace. I finished the fuss, made lunch, watched a documentary about migratory birds I'd bookmarked 6 weeks ago and kept postponing. Called my friend Patricia, who I hadn't spoken to properly in 2 months because I was always managing something for Marcus and Renata. We talked for an hour about nothing important. It was exactly what I needed. In the evening, I ordered Thai food, opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion, which I decided this qualified as, and sat in the good chair by the window. I read until 11 o'clock and went to bed. 8 hours, no dreams. The sleep of someone who has set down something they've been carrying a very long time. In the morning, I reviewed the accounts carefully. The supplemental card's last transaction, $412 at a luggage retailer 3 days before the trip. New luggage for a vacation she hadn't been invited to take, purchased on a card that wasn't hers. The poetry of it was not lost on me. I called my private banking contact about the resort. Repayment, $47,000. I explained that the primary account holder, had been excluded from the travel by the other members of the party without my consent, and requested a partial reversal. It was a long shot. I knew it going in, but a $47,000 dispute from a client with a seven-figure relationship gets looked at differently than the same dispute from a stranger. I wasn't counting on recovering the money. I wanted the record to exist. I wanted a document somewhere in a system describing what had happened at that airport in factual terms. Then I called Lawrence, my attorney. I told him I needed to review the asset portfolio I'd been managing on behalf of my son. He listened without interrupting. One of the things I've always appreciated about Lawrence. When I finished, he said, "How quickly do you want to move?" Deliberately, I said, not impulsively. I want to understand what I'm doing before I do it, but I want options on the table within the week. Done. At 9:17 that evening, Marcus called from his own cell, which meant he'd landed, cleared customs, found Wi-Fi or a local SIM. His voice, when I answered, was three things at once: exhausted, frightened, and still carrying the faint ghost of hope that this could be explained away. "Mama," he said. There it was, Mama. He hadn't called me that in years. Mama was from before, from the Saturday mornings with the stories about astronauts and kingdoms under the sea. "Marcus," I said, "they won't let us in." He said, "The reservation. There's some clause. They're saying you can lead." "Mom, what is happening?" "I can lead the reservation because I am not attending and the terms require my attendance. But we're here. The kids are here. We just flew 12 hours. I know that must have been a difficult light, a silence, background noise, the ambient sound of a hotel lobby, people and luggage, and a space designed to process high volumes of human beings quickly. Mom, the ghost of hope, smaller. Can you just call the hotel? Just tell them you authorize it. You don't have to be here. You just have to say the clause doesn't work that way. I said, I reviewed it before I booked. Why are you doing this? I thought about how to answer that. I had several answers. I gave him the short one, not because the long one wasn't true, but because he wasn't ready to receive it yet. You can't pour more into a person than they have capacity to hold at that moment. You gave my seat away, I said, and you agreed when Ranata said the grandkids loved her mother more. You said it would be better for everyone. A long silence. I know, he said very quietly. I know something in me wanted to move toward the admission, but I had been here before. A version of this conversation, at least 3 times in the last 5 years. And each time the admission was genuine in the moment and gone by the following week. I had learned to love my son without being naive about him. I'm going to authorize 1 room. I said standard room walk-in rate. You can pay for it. 1 room. Mom, there are 5 of us. I know how many of you there are. I booked 5 seats on a plane. Voices in the background. Ranata's and then Plet's and then Aiden asking about the pool. Put Ranatata on, I said, muffled back and forth. Then her voice. Careful now. The sharpness filed down. Diane, I want to say one thing, I told her, and then I'm going to authorize the room and hang up. Diane, if you just let me explain. I don't need an explanation. I want you to think about what you were willing to let your husband watch you do to his mother in public in front of his children because you decided I was old enough to just accept it. Think about what kind of woman makes that decision. Not for me. For yourself. Silence. You have time. I said, think tonight. I hung up, called the resort, authorized the room, finished my wine, went to bed. In the morning, there were 22 messages in the family group chat. Ranata and Marcus. Cycling through confusion, accusation, appeals to the children, and then around Message 17, something that looked like remorse. Marcus wrote, I should have said something at the airport. I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't respond to the group chat. I sent him a private message. I know we'll talk when you're home. What came next, I want to describe carefully because it's easy to tell it as a story about punishment. That's not what it was. What I was doing was structural, removing the architecture of fiction I had helped build because fiction is not a foundation. What Marcus and Renata had was a careful arrangement of assets and accounts designed to give the appearance of a self-made life to people who needed to believe they had won. I had participated in that arrangement willingly, out of love and out of fear. And both of those things are simultaneously true, but the weight of the fiction had finally exceeded what it could bear. And what broke it for me was an airport. The office lease was in my name and renewed annually. Lawrence recommended 60 days notice rather than abrupt termination. Firm but reasonable. The act of a woman restructuring, not retaliating. I sent the notice. Marcus called that evening, not to argue, but to ask if he could come over and talk. He arrived 2 hours later without Renata. He sat at my kitchen table in almost exactly the posture he'd had as a teenager. Elbows on the table, hands around a glass of water. He looked tired, in the bony way people look when they've been holding something up too long. How bad is it? He said. It depends on what you do next. Tell me what you see. You're better at this than I am. That broke something in me, the directness of it, the admission of what we both already knew. I poured us coffee and told him what I saw. The business, which had real clients but a cost structure requiring my subsidy to survive. The car, which was mine, the office, which was mine, the card, mine, the private school, which I was no longer funding at that rate, the pattern of the last 10 years, which had produced an adult man with no realistic understanding of what his life actually cost. I didn't say it cruelly. I said it the way I'd say it to a client who needed the hard truth, directly with the full picture on the table. He sat with it for a long time. He didn't argue. He said, did I know? Do you think? Did I know it wasn't real? I think you knew. I said, I think you were afraid to look at it. He nodded slowly. I'm going to have a conversation with Renata. That's your business, not mine. What I'm talking about is separate from the marriage. It's about you understanding what you actually have and what it actually costs and what you're actually capable of. That's independent of whoever you're married to. He nodded. The office. Is there any way to negotiate the timeline? 60 days is already reasonable, but if you want to use those 60 days to find alternative space, I'll give you an honest reference to the new landlord. Okay, the car, 30 days. Return it or find financing. Okay. The private school, I'll finish the semester I already paid for. After that, it needs to come from your actual income. He put his face in his hands. Not dramatically, just the movement of a man absorbing something. We sat in silence. My kitchen is a good room for silence. It holds conversations without judgment. What about us? Marcus asked. You and me, are we Marcus? I said, I love you. I have loved you since before you existed. Nothing at that airport changed that. But I've been doing you a disservice for 10 years. And I think part of me knew that, and I kept doing it because I was afraid that if I stopped, you'd stop needing me. That was my error. I'm correcting it. That's different from leaving. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said the most honest thing he'd said to me in Years, maybe ever. I think I've been afraid of you my whole life. Not of you being mean. You were never mean. Afraid of disappointing you. And somewhere along the way, I decided it was easier to not look at the things that would disappoint you. And then I started not looking at other things too. I reached across the table and put my hand over his the way I had when he was small, and something had scared him. Start looking, I said. It's survivable. He left around 10. I sat in the quiet for a long time after. What happened over the following weeks was not dramatic in the way real life rarely is. Marcus found a shared office space for a third of what the Midtown address cost. He had a hard conversation with Ranatata. I don't know the details and didn't ask. The car situation resolved when he found financing through a credit union. Expensive because his credit history was thinner than he'd realized, but his own. The school question was harder, and they ultimately found a good public option too. Me a way that Aiden and Lily adjusted to. With the resilience children have when the adults around them are honest. Instead of spinning, ran out of, and I didn't speak for 2 months. Then she called a Tuesday afternoon out of nowhere and said, I want to apologize, not because Marcus asked me to, because I've been treating you badly for a long time and calling it something else. I appreciate that. I said, I thought you'd be glad to stay home. She said, I thought you preferred your routine. I know you thought that. I said, that's part of the problem. I want to do better. Good. That's the right direction. We didn't cry over coffee. We were two adult women adjusting a complicated dynamic, and that's a slower process than the movie suggests, but we were adjusting. Pet, I let go of without the funding. The arrangement changed shape. She withdrew as people do when the incentive structure shifts. I wished her well. I meant it. 3 months after the airport, I joined a travel club. Women in their 50s and 60s who traveled internationally 3 or 4 times a year. The kind of travel that required you to carry your own bag and be willing to share a table with a stranger. I had never traveled that way. I always organized, planned, controlled. The first trip was to Portugal. 10 days, a coastal route I hadn't heard of before. My new friend Helena mentioned it. I sent Marcus a postcard from Lisbon. Just a photograph of the harbor and my handwriting on the back. Having a wonderful time. Love, Mom. He texted me a photo of Aiden and Lily making dinner with him. Badly, cheerfully. Flour everywhere. A look on my son's face I hadn't seen in years. Just his own face. I sat in a cafe in Lisbon and looked at that photo for a long time. When I was standing at that airport after Renata smiled and Marcus looked away, there was a moment, maybe 2 seconds, maybe 3, where I felt something I still don't have a fully clean word for. Grief, partly anger, certainly, but underneath both, something older, the feeling of a person who has been living for other people for so long she has forgotten what it feels like to live for herself. Suddenly face to face with that fact in the fluorescent light of a departure terminal. I had built a career. I had raised a child alone. I had managed money and risk and the 1,000 practical demands of a self-constructed life with genuine competence for 30 years. And somewhere in the decade between my son's wedding and that airport morning, I had started letting that competence be used as a resource for other people's comfort rather than my own. That's what I was walking away from. Not my son, not even Renata entirely. The version of myself that had decided her own needs were a secondary consideration to everyone Elsa's peace of mind. That version was done. I walked out into the Atlanta morning and made 3 calls. Everything that followed was just the arithmetic of a decision that had already been made. Clearly, finally, without hesitation, standing in the fluorescent light, watching my son look at the floor. The 3 calls took less than 15 minutes. 30 years of building something. 15 minutes to decide it was mine again. Look at your accounts. Check who is holding the title on your life. And if it's not you, start making calls.